My name's David Eedle. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at EdSmart, so I'm acting as the host and I guess MC this afternoon. I think it's pretty fair to say, if you watch the newspapers, that pretty much every one of us now has personally been the subject of some kind of data privacy breach or cybersecurity breach. I was reading the news this morning, Medicare private, I think they've announced it's pretty much up to 10 million Australians, and even some records were dumped this morning to prove that they really did have the data. So look, we totally get that we cannot cover everything in 60 minutes, but what we do hope is that today's webinar gives you some ideas, practical advice, and so on, that at a high level, that you can take back to your school and organisation. I'll introduce myself a little more on the panel in a moment, but first maybe I'll just run us through the agenda of what we hope to cover over the next 60 minutes. So we're breaking this into a couple of sections. We'll be talking about just, kind of setting the scene. What is data security for schools? What do they need to be paying attention to? We will hear directly from somebody at the coalface in a school, talking about how that school goes about protecting data, the way they've reacted to recent cybersecurity breaches and so on. And then move into a section looking at just what are some absolutely essential steps that a school could take to secure their data and implement a security plan. We will try and time that to be about 45 minutes to make sure there's 15 minutes left over for you to ask questions. As you can see on the screen, we'll ask you to pop your question into the Teams chat and try to get through as many as we can. If you'd prefer not to put your name on something, you can email Emma. Emma is one of my team. She's sitting there behind the scenes. You are welcome to email Emma directly, emma@edsmart.com, and she'll pass the question to me without anybody's name on it. As I mentioned a moment ago, we are recording today. We will distribute the link to the webinar along with some other information, which I'll cover off at the end. So let me introduce who we have on the panel today. You have me. And Ashley, if you wouldn't mind just moving a slide, that'd be great. Thank you. You have me. I'm David Eedle. I am the co-founder at EdSmart. I'm the guy who had the idea about 8 years ago, and then started to wonder what on earth he was doing. But I have a very long background in SaaS firms, online technologies. I've worked both in San Francisco and here in Australia. Today, EdSmart supports a very large population, so a very large group of people. You can see some numbers there. That includes about 750,000 parents and caregivers and more than 500,000 students. So issues around data security, privacy, and so on are obviously extremely close to our hearts. I'm very pleased to introduce our two panelists with us today. First up, James Lacey. James is head of GRC at Control Group. He has a long work history around governance, risk, compliance. He has designed security plans, performed risk assessments, supported organisations to be compliant with various security and cyber security standards, including ISO 27001, which I'm sure a lot of you would be familiar with. And also joining, I'm absolutely delighted to have Thomas Blackwood. Thomas is head of ICT at Fahan School. Even before starting at Fahan, Thomas worked across cybersecurity and in corporate IT, and we're extremely delighted to have him with us, sharing his absolutely at the coalface experiences of what is it like trying to manage these issues at a large independent school in Australia. Incidentally, I've mentioned Emma, but I just want to give thanks to Emma and Tim, who are on this meeting. They're from my team, and also Ashley over at Control Group. They're the ones who've done the heavy lifting to put all of this together so that James, Thomas, and I can be with you today. So thank you, team. We really do appreciate it. All right, let's move on, and we'll start sort of talking to James. My role here is really just to prompt James and Thomas with a few leading questions, as it were. But obviously we're here for their expertise, their experience, their skills. So James, I'll ask the leading questions, as you can see on the screen. Let's maybe talk about some of the, what are the unique considerations that schools need to take into account when it comes to data security?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, David. So when it comes to schools in particular, a major concern is vast volumes, obviously, of highly sensitive PII and family information. A great deal of that data, and you can look exactly back like 2 weeks ago to Optus Medibank. Many schools will be holding on to similar information about individuals, about students, and also about families and their relationships. Absolutely proves to be a bit of a challenge, particularly when it comes to things like data retention or backups and so on. Additionally, depending on where this information is hosted, you've also got concerns around data ransom or possibly ransomware being leveled against the school. Outside of that, I'd say complex identity and access management is definitely the second thing I'd be thinking of with schools. You have a lot of students coming in and out. You have onboarding and offboarding every single year for a new round of kids. The easiest way into any organization is through trusted credentials. Everyone's working remote today, and that includes hackers as well. So making sure that IDAM mechanisms, onboarding, offboarding are effective, they're measurable, they're auditable, that least privilege is being applied. And, given many schools work in spaces that are encouraging open, collaborative work, makes it a bit tricky. Other than that, you've also probably got opportunistic students as well. So there's a good potential for reputationally damaging attacks from students who might take advantage or who might be careless, possibly. You got to remember the lapsus hacks, which occurred, I think the last round of arrests were at least in April this year. Microsoft, T-Mobile, NVIDIA ended up resulting in arrests of about 7 people aged between 16 and 21. So you can't discount the quality of students either, or what they might try.
I was just going to touch on, I think you're talking about schools that have this challenge around a really quite diverse population, students, parents, staff, and so on. Is that one of the reasons why they're particularly vulnerable? And what are some of the ways that they might be able to overcome that?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of a wide untrusted user base, with many of our assessments, we'll end up looking for credentials that have been leaked in other services. Anything that's got a domain of our target organization at the back of it, has there been a username and password pop up somewhere else online? And with schools, it's a case of trying to filter out the results, because there are literally thousands will turn up for any individual school, just because students, teachers, anyone really will end up using those credentials for personal services, for non-school related or possibly even school related uses. But if they aren't careful with the way passwords are managed, and if schools aren't careful with the way they onboard these third-party systems and don't integrate them into their identity management systems, then they can expose themselves to that kind of credential compromise.
I've talked to IT managers. They're running fleets of, 1,500 devices. They've got 4 segments. They've got CCTV. They've got facility staff who just stick a CCTV camera up and connect it to the Wi-Fi, and so on. So I'm presuming, again, they're all vectors for attack into the school systems.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, a lot of this does roll into identity and access management, and a bit of it does roll into third-party systems, because you will have vendors who are managing some of these or who have external access to them. So a great deal of care has to be taken when onboarding those kind of vendors, performing your third-party assessments, or even just at a more basic level, defining the rules around which you set acceptable behavior or acceptable controls for the systems you introduce to an environment. Because a great deal of it, while a lot of it is around, hacking, taking advantage of technical vulnerabilities, very much so it's got to be business processes, IT processes that are taking security to heart.
Yeah, I'm still astounded at the number of devices and just kind of the breadth of it. You and I are going to talk a little bit more later in this webinar, and I might touch a bit more on vendors and the third parties with data, which includes, and I'll put my hand up, includes us, because I think that there's a really interesting conversation around there. Look, we've talked about Medibank Private, and we all know about Optus and so on, but are there other real world examples that you can put forward that we could learn from, that we can take something away?
Yeah, absolutely. So Pinehorse Technology Group, the most recent one, they're very education adjacent, major vendor for the government, who I believe were taking healthcare, or sorry, health surveys for students as they were being enrolled. So they've undergone a pretty serious hack recently, which I believe included both ransom and encryption on that front. When it comes to a lot of third parties, at least for organizations, they need to understand, while disaster recovery responsibilities may not be sitting with them, business response, when that service you depend on goes down, that's got to be taken into account. It's got to be planned. Kilvington Grammar, I think, is the most recent victim, popped up over the weekend, I'm pretty sure, who may have been ransomed or may have possibly suffered ransomware. There's still details emerging about that, but if you look at the US, it's more or less a hack a week, and that includes school systems. ACSC ended up putting out their most recent, year in review. Education, higher education as well, training services, 11% of all attacks, and the highest group individually targeted. So again,
I have a Google alert for education schools ransomware. So I get the Google News alerts each, summary each day, and there is something every day, and especially out of the US, whether it's a school district or a college or an individual school, there is not a day where my Google alert doesn't toss up an example of a school having a problem. And in fact, I was on in a different meeting on Monday evening. And talking about and in fact, I think some in this group, we've talked about it, the underreporting by schools, and well, indeed, everybody, that is, whatever the statistics that we see about breaches, I'm pretty confident that the number is much larger, and I'm guessing you'd support that assertion.
Yeah, absolutely. ACSC did put out some information recently. They think about 60% of attacks, again, this is on individuals, there's situations where they won't even seek help, essentially. And this includes things like business invoice redirection attacks, ransomware attacks, individual fraud on that level. Overall, I mean, every single year it is trending up, but again, we've found that it is trending up this year as well. So particularly for ransomware.
Yeah, it's this ain't an issue that's going away. And maybe just to close out this little part of the conversation is, I can tell you that our cyber insurance here at EdSmart went up 30% this year. So, the insurers at the end of the day are insuring that risk, and whilst so they're then factoring that in, and guess what? That's just added a significant amount to my business cost, and I suspect that everybody's insurance has subsequently also gone up a similar amount.
Certainly say the last 4 years, seeing questionnaires go from a flat yes, no, do you have this, do you do this, to a quite detailed and expanded, tell us how you're doing all this. When's the last time you tested your business continuity plan, your incident response plan? We saw you're right. We saw a much more detailed review from our insurer this time round. About 3 months ago, I think 4 months ago, it renewed, asking a lot more questions about our posture around cybersecurity. And even then,
we get the quote and it's 30%, you know, from our insurance broker, and it's 30% more than we paid the previous year. Terrific. I think now it's time to talk to somebody who actually works in a school, and it's my pleasure to introduce Thomas Blackwood from Fahan College. Thomas, look, you're right at the coalface. You're the one who's doing, you're dealing with this every day in a school environment. So, you know, tell us what you're doing. You know, how are you reacting to this world that we now live in?
Yeah, look, thanks, David. First, I'll give some background on Fahan School, you know, who we are and you know, where we come from. We're around 420 students, Southern Tasmania, around 90 permanent staff. And in 2018, when I sort of joined Fahan School, our cybersecurity spending is a part of the IT budget was right around 2%, quite low, you know, in comparison. And we'll advance the slide. There's some research that I had done that I grabbed from Deloitte that showed cybersecurity spending across IT sectors. And the average for organizations as a whole, 2019 was right around 10%. If we could advance the slide, we'll just get that up. And in 2020, shot up to about 11%. So it was clear that we as an organization, had a lot of catching up to do, right? Just to kind of get in line with what other organizations are doing. By 2022, we'd gotten that spending up to around 8-9%, more in line with what we're seeing there, in part due to some cyber incidents we suffered in 2020 and 2021. But that was good, you know, more spending, we could do more initiatives to make ourselves feel secure, sort of patch those gaps that we fell victim to. We got a fairly robust defense in depth strategy that sort of came off of that. So perimeter firewall, redundant internal firewalls with a focus on zero trust. We got a DMZ at a hosted data center, advanced endpoint protection with vulnerability scanning, MFA across our entire user base, end user awareness training. We'd eliminated USBs off the campus, and began sort of a thorough dive into the Essential 8 framework. So, you know, we're really kind of digging in hard to prevent a sort of a third attack, right? The problem that sort of caused for us, and we didn't realize it at the time, is we really became complacent. You know, we were relying on the technology to keep us safe. It's blinking away, you know, doing its job, but we're not sort of, you know, getting to that next level. Okay. So as I sort of researched what comes next, you know, what comes next after you spend all this money, you know, do you go to 20%? Do you go to 30%? That doesn't really make sense. And I think what you find is, you know, you get up to that level, further investment, you know, as far as technology is concerned, you'll get marginal returns. So I found this chart, which I found quite eye-opening, is these 5 levels across, you know, your cybersecurity maturity as an organization. And you sort of look at the first level, that immature level, where the overarching idea is cyber isn't an issue for us. You know, you're just completely oblivious to what's going on. You're not even thinking about it. And really that last point, seen as a technology issue, I think that drives home a lot of where we as schools started, right, as IT managers and leaders, that cyber defense was, you know, responsibility fell on the IT department. Where really, as you kind of go across this chart, it falls more into it's an organizational issue. You know, it's everyone's responsibility. So I sort of identified that we probably fell right in that investing advanced level. You know, we're spending a lot of money looking to, well, what can we spend on next? But really, if something were to happen today, we would absolutely have that blue highlighted phrase, you know, don't understand what happened. You know, we did everything right. We engaged consultants. They said we need this, and that, but we still failed, right? So that phrase in green, there's no absolute security. We need to manage risk. It really resonated for us as an organization. And talking earlier about the recent data breaches, I think it's become just absolutely evident that no matter the amount of money you spend patching holes, you're never going to be secure. Okay, there's no absolute security. What you need to do, what Fahan School needs to do, is manage the risk. So when something does happen, not if, but when, we can pick ourselves up quite quickly, respond. We're agile, nimble, and continue operating as a business, right? Not letting it get the best of us. Yeah, so what does that mean to manage risk, right? So if this is the first time you're sort of hearing about this, what do you do? Where do you get started? Well, you know, at its core level, it's really just about identifying the risks within your business, and whether that's cyber, data. You'll probably have risk management across your school for other areas, but cyber needs to be a part of that conversation, right? So having a plan in place for when something does happen, you can just pull out the playbook and say, this is what's happened, here's the impact, here's how we're going to respond, right? So as far as Fahan's concerned, we're conducting a formal risk assessment with a focus on cyber that's going to detail all of our infrastructure, services, what data we hold, the third parties that we engage with, and what risks all of those entities face on a daily basis, and what's our response if those become unavailable or compromised, right? So what we're going to do. By identifying those risks, we can assign priority, and for anything that's critical, high, maybe even medium, we can focus resources and capital, right? Allocate stuff to really protect them and keep them secure, because without understanding what we need to protect, what's most at risk, you're kind of just throwing money, randomly, right? So having a good focus with a risk assessment is really going to help us out in doing that. So at the end of this risk assessment, we'll be able to really have a formal incident response plan. So all of those risks will have action items as well as response items on what to do. And we will go from really not expecting a cyber attack and we're safe and secure to an organization that's, we're honestly expecting one at any time. That's fine. We're going to be very mature in our response and how we deal with it. So, a lot of you, if you're at that first level, you're at that sort of immature, you understand it's an issue, it's keeping you up at night, but you're having, a hard time getting buy-in from your senior leadership. You need to get the conversation going around the risk, right? Because if they don't understand what the risks are, they're not going to be able to give you the resources to fight them. And I think with these recent data breaches, I think the conversation is going to be coming regardless, right? I think a lot of senior leadership, the boards, they're going to want answers to certain questions for your organization. If you're not at that immature, you're sort of at that investing advanced level, take that phrase to heart, right? There's no absolute security. We need to manage risk. And that's something that Control Group is going to be, great with, right? Seek out a consultancy, someone that can help you adopt a framework and do some governance, right, around your policies and compliance. And I'll talk about sort of some frameworks a bit later. So
to the next slide, please. So Thomas, I think that's a really great scene setter for us, but maybe let's move into, so what have you actually been doing at school? What are the measures that you've been putting into place?
Right. So as I mentioned, historically, we've really relied on technology to safeguard our organization and business. And now we're looking more into what processes do we have, what safeguards do we need to put in that isn't technology, right? Like an incident response plan, the risk assessment. Just spending money on the hardware and software, that's great as an initial investment, but really getting that maturity level up, that's going to come in with adopting your frameworks and putting in controls and things like that to respond. So I think it's also important to look at what processes you have already and make sure that those are being followed, right? If you have a password policy, but you're constantly making exceptions, or you've got an admin password that's quite complex, but you're handing it out to everyone because it's just too hard to install the software yourself, that's going to introduce risks, right? So how well are those internal processes followed? If you're not following them yet, you need to change that culture around, because putting in those controls without following them strictly isn't going to do you much good. Yeah. No,
I think it's lovely having a plan, but you actually have to do it. I think there's an enormous amount of effort put into preparation and so on, but it's the actual doing of it and the ongoing, trying to convince people and make them understand this is not a set and forget. This is an everyday conversation that we have constantly and that we're reviewing on a regular basis. So look, if the worst comes to the worst, and Ashley, if you wouldn't mind moving a slide forward, if the worst comes to a worst, what does the school, what are your thoughts about the way a school does react to a data breach?
Yeah, so first I'll just touch on what you can do to prepare for a data breach. because preparation is going to go a long way when these types of things happen. And there just really isn't time to come up with a plan once it happens, right? I mean, as we've seen with a lot of these, companies are sort of expected to notify their end users, within days, if not the day of. So look, I'm not going to tell you what kind of tools you need, what sort of network topology you need to adopt, kind of access controls you need to have, because it's really going to depend, where you are on that maturity level, where you are financially. But what I will say is really to start out is adopt a framework. And on screen, we've got the link to the Essential 8. That's where we started probably about 2 years ago, and it's a free Australian resource that's been put out for Australian businesses as a framework to adopt. And it isn't as comprehensive as some of the others, but it's a great place to start, right? So if you move to the next slide, when you go to this link, there's sort of two different sections of the Essential 8. One's a very high level, basic look, and you sort of look at it and you think, oh, this is easy. You're like, I'll have the Essential 8 done, by next week. But what you want to focus on is this appendix, right, where it's got the different maturity levels, and some of them are quite comprehensive. So I would map this out against your organization. The application control, there'll be one for MFA, backups, vulnerability scanning, those 8 areas. Map out where you are against those different maturity levels, and sort of come up with plans to either implement, or you've just decided you're not going to implement it. And if you move to the next slide, you'll see that that's what Fahan School has done. I think we list here showing MFA and regular backups. Green is implementation. We've got level 1, level 2, level 3. Yellow is there's a plan, it's not implemented yet, and pink, red, no plan for implementation, with some notes to go along. So if you can do that with each of the controls, you can really get started, with this framework. Beyond that, if you want something a bit more comprehensive, the NIST framework, or as James mentioned, the ISO 27001, quite comprehensive. Recommend you probably partner up with a consultancy to kind of get some assistance getting that going. The consultancy partnerships incredibly useful as well for when you do have a data breach, right? You're going to be able to lean on them for forensics advice, potentially legal advice as well. So recommend you get that done before you have an incident, because again, there's just not going to be time to really shore up those resources. If you're not using multi-factor authentication, get it enabled, right? Just communicate those risks to your higher ups if they still don't believe it's an issue. But again, I'm thinking it really should be. Cyber, as far as I've seen, cyber insurance is mandating MFA. So if you don't have it, not really sure why that's the case. It's just a safeguard. Be wary of open source. So a lot of software that's open source is free, it's convenient, but is really on you to update and manage and be across vulnerabilities and exploits. We saw with the Log4j last December, really kind of opened a lot of our eyes to, is open source the best way to go? It's definitely a risk. So, well, there's not an upfront cost. There is a cost in you having to be aware of that, right? If we can go to the next slide, I just want to flash up some free tools that Fahan School used back in the day before sort of spending a bit more money. A lot of these are all of these are free. The MX Toolbox, that's a Microsoft product, I believe, and it'll monitor your IP addresses. So your external IPs, if they show up in the global spam house blacklists and things like that, it'll let you know. So you might have a student on your public IP start spamming email with a botnet or something, you'll get blacklisted, and then this will let you know, and then you can apply to be unlisted. GoFish if you want some sort of free user awareness training for your staff. Have I been pwned? So James mentioned earlier the domain searches. So if student accounts get compromised in a data breach, you can register your domain or domains on the Have I Been Pwned, and you get alerts if any of those domains show up. So occasionally you'll get students, staff, and then you can reset the passwords, maybe educate them a bit as to what happened. The Joe Sandbox, great tool to detonate payloads in a safe environment. We've used it for staff that have clicked on phishing links, actually, used the link or downloaded the attachment, opened it up on the computer, and then we've got to figure out, do we need to do something? Do we need to shut down the network and what's going on? So you can detonate it and see, okay, it's built for Windows. They used it on a Mac, didn't do anything. that's fine. We can move on. And lastly, the Qualys Community Edition vulnerability scanning. So this will, I think, allows 3 IPs that you can get scanned for free. And if you're smart, you can run the report, re-register some different IPs, and just repeat. So you can kind of get a number of free scans done through that tool. And look, beyond that, if you're kind of just in the middle, you're spending that money, you don't need the free resources because you've got paid services that take care of that. Get involved with input in the board governance, the risk management, because that's going to be the next level for your journey, right? To sort of become a leader in the space. I'm going to flash up some questions on the screen and just try to get these answers down, right? So if you're not having the conversation with your senior leadership, with your board already, note these questions down, get the answers, and start the conversation with these answers. So if we can go to the next slide. So essentially, do you have effective cyber policies and a security program which aligns with your business? Have you identified your crown jewels? How are you protecting those crown jewels? Are you aware of compliance and regulatory requirements? What are the biggest threats to your business? If you have a cyber breach, how quickly can you recover? Have you tested it? And do you have a cyber assurance program? So, you hold data, what are you doing with it? How are you sort of, assuring that it's safe? So those are all answers that I think a lot of, boards are now expecting to have answers to if they haven't asked you already. So getting that conversation started will help move you along, in that level. Right. So
Thomas, this is awesome, and I'm just watching time. Can I just pick up on one thing, and again, it'll be as much as you want to say, but you mentioned that you have had a couple of incidents at the school. And just briefly, are you prepared to tell us anything, just the nature of them, give us a sense of what happened?
Yeah, so in both cases, it was credential compromise. The first one was with a very high-level senior staff account through the Microsoft platform. We didn't have two-factor authentication enabled, and the attacker had access out of Pakistan to the email, OneDrive, all that good stuff. So we had to assume it was a total data loss from that account. And forensics pulled out all kinds of emails, right? At that high level, there were driver's license, passports, very sensitive student information, pastoral care records that had gotten out, right? So it was indeed notifiable. The second breach involved a student guessing a staff member's password. We had MFA, so that first data breach, one of the controls we put in was two-factor, but we didn't turn it on for internal to the school. So if you were at school on the network, you did not need the two-factor code. We had that trust issue where we thought, well, we can trust if people are at school, right? Not the case. Student guessed the password. It was able to log on to the system as a staff member, downloaded lots of pastoral care information about their friends, enemies, and then used that to sort of bully, and it got quite nasty, right? So
wow. I think by the way, the notion that a staff member had a guessable password is immediately, kind of takes you, quite obviously a red flag. And I think that kind of segues, I hope, nicely, because and Thomas, thank you. And I will just point out, Thomas is sticking around for the Q&A at the end here. But that kind of segues us nicely to come back to James, because my question to James was, kind of building on what Thomas has been, building on all of this, what are the absolutely essential steps that a school can take, James? And a guessable password, I'm presuming that's passwords are high on your list there. And Ashley, if we could just move a slide, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys. So yeah, in terms of exactly what essential steps should be taken, I think really what Tom mentioned much earlier on around risk ownership, it's 100% got to be owned and driven by the business. If there is going to be a significant event, an outage, an incident, something where you've got to figure out what are our obligations for notification. This is not all a set of questions you want to sit with IT. There are wide responsibilities within the exec team in any organization. to react to the investigation as it unfolds, because it won't all be known on day one, but also to have responsibilities in that space when it comes to who discloses and when. So taking all that into account, risk ownership really has to exist with the business. The other side of things as well is understanding where your information is. What's the importance of that data from a confidentiality, integrity, availability perspective? What's the impact on the organization if any of those attributes are broken? How many records in the environment that's storing or processing that data are we looking at? How does that affect impact as well? All these things need to be taken into account, or should be essentially your first steps in identifying what your crown jewels are, what your critical systems are, and to help you define the rules of what you expect for any environment that stores or processes that information. And that could be password management processes, it could be user credential processes, it could be asset management, vulnerability management, the list goes on. So how do those rules get applied, and how do they treat the risks you've identified within your organization?
James, Thomas talked about the fact that they had a breach, in fact, a couple. So, from your perspective, what are the crucial steps for a school who's experiencing or has experienced the data breach?
Well, the most crucial step happens before the incident, and that is plan.
Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
Go for it. Yeah, organize yourself. Figure out exactly, okay, from our critical environments, if we were to lose access to one of these, and that includes log information, that includes just user access, what data was even sitting in there, what information are we able to piece together from other sources to understand what steps an attacker took when they're in that environment, to understand what data might have been extracted, what information was looked at, viewed, previewed, to determine the scope of any notification that comes up. Beyond that, though, planning out your incident response and testing that plan, particularly with the executive team, is a really critical step. I strongly consider it for any organization, even early on, because it really highlights exactly where the deficiencies might be as you're performing that investigation, or rather as you're going through an event by event. Hey, we've woken up, someone's woken up, it's 2 a.m. For whatever reason, no one in the school can log into Office 365. Looks like someone's taken over the tenancy. What do we even need in order to prove to Microsoft that we are the owners of that tenancy? How do we get access back in that system? What could the attackers be doing at that point? How do we even communicate to our staff tomorrow exactly what they should be doing when it comes to classes and so on? How do we get that message out to students? Is there another system we can use, and so on? So absolutely setting those responsibilities and familiarizing everyone with how an incident can twist and go wrong is critical for that business buy-in.
You picked me up beautifully on, by the way, it was everything that you did before the breach.
Yeah.
Which, EdSmart, of course, we achieved ISO 27001 certification quite recently, but honestly, that was 14, 15 months of work from the moment that I said, okay, we're going to do this, through to actually receiving our certification. So, it's 14 months process to get to that certification. And of course, it's, as we've talked about earlier, it's an ongoing conversation. It's an ongoing set of activities that we treat with the utmost care. So, let's try to wrap it into, what are the most important things schools should be, what are the big deal things they need to remember when they're talking about data security at the school?
Look, security is a whole of organization effort. Penetration testing, security monitoring, phishing campaigns, endpoint security, they're all tools to treat risks. If you don't understand the risks that your organization faces based on the environment they work in, how they utilize IT as a force multiplier for work, then you're going to have a very hard time determining how much is enough. So without a proper assessment process, you also can't really understand what are the solutions that are the best quality for us, what are going to treat the most problems that we have. So it really truly does start with risk assessment, understanding your exposure, understanding where you're dependent on technology, so that then you can start building around a set of rules, a set of internal standards that follow external ones that are being published, like Essential 8, NIST CSF, ISO 27001. All these things inform how you manage your information security system, how the business participates in that system, how the users are informed of their expectations, their obligations when it comes to security. I mean, we talk a fair bit about breaches, but how many, I guess, can say that everyone in their organization understands what an incident even looks like and who they need to report it to?
I do want to try to make sure we get to Q&A, so in a couple of minutes, James, but let's ask a different question a different way. What do you see as the common mistakes? Like, you know, what are the things that you just slap your head and go, why on earth? Whether it's a school or not, but just in general around data security and privacy.
I feel it's not necessarily a common mistake, more or less, but many organizations, they will jump straight to the solutions. They will know that they've got to do a pen test, but they won't really define the reason why. They won't set criteria for exactly what they expect the scope of that testing to be. They'll know they've gone through a test sometime in the last 12 months and they'll feel secure, but if the scope of that testing doesn't cover off things like, you know, essential internal networks, if they don't understand what kind of testing is being performed by the third parties that they're leaning on, if those rules internally are not being set, then it makes it quite difficult to audit, to understand, to review your systems, to maintain your controls, and to feel secure that they're being done right. Tom mentioned before about complacency. If you don't set expectations, or at least don't understand exactly how important a control is to your organization in the context of your risk, you can't reasonably say why you want to review that control every 3 months, or come back to it once a month, or, you know, raise it to that executive team and saying, hey, we need buy-in for this because, you know, this is an exposure. I just can't quite articulate why. So it really starts with understanding your risks so that you can then set rules and then use tools, outside consultants, internal tools, whatever it is, to treat those problems or find solutions for them.
Terrific, James. Thank you. Just, you know, obviously, again, our personal experience, and obviously, I should always emphasize, you know, I don't work in a school, and I've never worked in a school. I went to a school, but that's the sum total of my experience in a school, albeit we work with a very large number of schools. But, you know, the process of gaining our ISO certification, I was just trying to remember the number of pieces of evidence that we had to capture across all our systems and processes and so on, in order to satisfy the audit. Off the top of my head, it was like 152 items, which everything from proving that we had two-factor turned on through to how do we record background checks and interview notes for the staff that we hire who would have access to personal information. We even had to move the Wi-Fi router at our office because it was deemed too close to the front door. So it was an astoundingly wide range of evidence and information that we had to capture.
The important thing to remember with these kind of controls and these sorts of standards is that they are always risk informed. So if there is an exposure, that's where it starts, whether you introduce a control or not, or decide exactly what the scope of applicability is for your organization.
Yeah. Awesome. James, thank you. And Thomas, thank you. We'll open up Q&A. As a reminder, and if Ash wouldn't mind just moving a slide forward, please. We'll open up for Q&A. You are welcome to ask a question. As I said, just pop it into the Teams chat, and we'll try and answer. Alternatively, you can email, if you don't want to put your name on it, you can just email emma@edsmart.com. I've got her on Slack on my other screen, so that she can feed some questions to me. I've got a couple that we're already kicking around. And James and Thomas, please just jump in, whichever one of you feels best. I think one of the questions I got, it says it sounds like you can throw a lot of money at cybersecurity with not necessarily better results. How do you hit on the sweet spot?
I suppose when it comes to investment and controls and so on, cybersecurity, at least to me, is for many organizations a risk that hasn't been fully articulated or fully understood. The risk is there regardless of whether or not you invest the money or not. You are investing that money to avoid that unacceptable impact on the organization. So your investment is essentially a self-insurance. Prevent or limit the impact of whatever could happen, detect it earlier, deciding exactly how far you're willing to let an attacker get before that detection or before that control stops them has got to be an informed decision. And if it's not informed, then it's uncontrolled risk that's either not understood or not articulated.
I've got a question for Thomas. Is he finding that parents are being spooked by recent high-profile cyber breaches? And has Fahan had to? If so, what are Fahan's tactics for setting minds at ease? I think that's pretty relevant given the prominence in the media at the moment.
Yeah, look, so we really haven't had much parent outreach to the school. We are trying to get on the front foot, of those questions. What we're doing around cybersecurity. So, I mentioned MFA. That control that was only enabled for staff. For having two-factor for parents and students. A few years ago, that would have just seemed crazy. As of last week, MFA is enabled for parents. I think we're just trying to drive home that we're getting on the front foot. We don't want a parent coming to us and saying, I think my account was hacked. Why didn't you have two-factor, right? Because that answer is a lot harder to give than why do you have two-factor? Okay. I was in a meeting literally just a few hours ago, and we were discussing if we need the date of birth on the student ID card, right? So for, kindergarten to year 4, you've got really young minors. You've got the date of birth, a picture, and their name, right? What happens when they misplace that card, which they're going to do, okay? You've now got sensitive information that's misplaced, and with that date of birth, if it's just a name, it's a name. If it's a date, it's a date. But you put the two together, and it becomes, PII. So the conversation's happening around, can we be sensible? Can we rejig, how we did things in the past to get in front of these issues? Because we want to seem like we're doing something, right? We don't want parents to come to us and say, why aren't you doing this? We want to, announce to them, this is what we're doing, right? So.
Yeah. Wow, terrific. I'm surprised more parents or guardians aren't contacting schools. Then again, they're probably too busy dealing with the fact that their Medicare information just got released. Couple of questions from Colin. Thank you, Colin. I'm going to split this. There's two distinct ones, so I'll ask them separately. The first was, is there a frequency that you recommend for phishing exercises? That might be one for James, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, for us, at least when it comes to phishing, how many of your staff are failing? That'll be the first metric to decide how often you do it. For most organizations, we tend to recommend monthly. Again, depends on the software a bit, on what you use and how much maintenance it requires and how creative it can be with when it comes to those phishing emails. If staff are still seeing the exact same message every single time, then they're going to get a bit bored with that, I imagine.
I had a comment. I was talking to the IT director of a large school in Sydney the other day, and he said they had been avoiding phishing exercises because it could be construed as the school evidencing a lack of trust in the staff. And I just like, okay, but
that's what we want.
As metrics go,
yeah, don't trust anyone, right?
Yeah, exactly. From Chris, this one's for you, Thomas, asking how Fahan managed the data breach notification when the high-level school credentials were compromised. How did you establish who was affected? I think is a summary.
Yeah, so that involved a forensic firm. They, plugged the Office 365 account into one of the proprietary tools, and it ticked away very expensively for a few months, aggregating the data, classifying it, and at the end it spat out a number of I guess names, types of data, and what classification it was. And then at the end of the day, that gave us the notifications that we needed to send out. Back then, it was a very limited notification to those affected individuals. I think today, because it took so long to get to that point, it was several months before it spat out who was impacted. I think today the thinking would be we would just notify the community that we've had some sort of incident, and further information would be ongoing. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of these larger organizations, Medibank, for example, just kind of notifying as it happens.
Yeah. This may be for both of you. Do you recommend password managers for staff? Someone saying we've just moved to Bitwarden for our IT team.
So we started with password management just for the IT team. We've moved just this last year to password management for all of our administration staff. So not teaching staff yet. It's just a bit of a cost issue, but absolutely for administration staff. Just they're sharing passwords. They might be writing them down for your shared web services. Like frequent flyer miles when they're booking PL or something. Password managers take care of that, right? So yeah,
100%, and especially for essential roles. Anyone within finance, anyone within technology, anyone with any sort of privileged access. I think the average user at this point has to keep track of anywhere between 180 passwords or user accounts for themselves. That being said, password managers are great, but the more accounts you can set up with single sign-on, even better, because you have a central place to audit things and understand if that account was compromised, what other services could have been touched, and you can validate whether or not someone's authenticated onto those services without digging into each one individually.
Yeah, we use 1Password at EdSmart, and we have it segmented into lots of different vaults according to roles and so on. There are multiple engineering vaults because different members of the engineering team need different levels of access and so on. And we put that in quite some time ago now, and that's just been fantastic. At one stage we were holding some credentials in a spreadsheet on a drive, and we know better, so we dealt with it. Thomas, you're very popular. Do you have multi-factor authentication enabled for students K to 12? If so, what method are you using with the younger students? And I guess the obvious thing is trying to get 7-year-olds to do 2-factor authentication for an Office 365 sign-in is probably an entertaining proposition. So that somebody's interested in your feedback on that.
Yeah, so look, we have enabled it for the year 7 to 12. Before that, we don't really see them needing to access their accounts outside of school. The data that they're going to have is quite limited, and asking them to have a personal email address or a mobile phone, you're really getting into the weeds, around what parents can approve. So for the 7s to 12s, we sort of have that discussion with parents, and if parents don't want them to use a personal email or use a mobile phone, then we don't push it. But it is there available for the students to use, and we've seen a pretty high uptake.
Yeah. So. I mean, I have, it's a disclaimer, I have 3 children, 2 of which have finished school, but all of them have had, the ones who are able to use a mobile phone have had one since grade 6, 7. But then again, they also had a computer sitting in their cot because I'm their parent. So they kind of grew up with keyboards. The interesting question from Kyle. Is there such a thing as being overprotective, locking down accounts, infrastructure too much? Where's the line between staying agile as a school and protecting our stakeholders?
Look, I think, James, if you want. I think it's easy to, as James said, right? A lot of these things are just tools, that you can use. I think what you need to focus on is identifying what the risks are in your organization, right? Where do you need to spend that money? If you don't have a risk, if you don't need to protect, certain data, then don't, waste resources doing it. Okay, so I think the last few years, especially at Fahan School, we'd have vendors tell us, oh, you need this, it's going to solve this problem, and there was this data breach, so you need to spend money here to protect you against that. And I think it was kind of, okay, we're just going to do what we're told, right? But, looking back, I think we could have been smarter about spending that money, right? And, having a risk assessment done to really identify those key areas, here's where you really need to focus on and spend the money and, get user awareness training, because there's, if someone's going to enter their credentials into a website, there's no point spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on complex firewalls and all that sort of stuff when you're just going to get breached, when they're at home logging into web services. So, yeah,
James, sorry, I think maybe did you have a thought there too?
Yeah, no, just on that sort of overprotective front. Look, from my perspective, I'm really going to say too much is too much. But you've got to take really much a measured approach when it comes to your controls. The more controls you have, the more you have to maintain. So again, it comes down to finding the most efficient solutions. They're going to treat the problems that you've got. Where's your essential information? How many layers of controls that are either going to outright stop an attacker or alert you that something is going on are in between that external access and the data you're trying to protect.
Yeah. Sorry, I've just had so I think this has come on email maybe. Should schools be looking at reducing the amount of data they keep on file to mitigate risk? And, I think the comment is, Optus, if we read correctly, Optus had driver's licenses dating back 20 years, and information on file. Thomas, is that something, I've seen a number of our customer schools go through like a data audit process almost like, do we, here's a list of all the pieces of information we're holding. Do we actually need to hold it? And what's the life, the data retention on each of those elements, not just overall, but each of those elements? Because I know that some independent schools particularly have had legal advice that their retention policy should be indefinite, but that seems contrary to the notion of minimal information for the minimal amount of time.
Yeah, look, I think there is that blanket, if you've got Indigenous students, you have to keep everything for forever and 75 years otherwise. But what I've looked into, that is very much just a blanket, not too specific. So I think classifying your data, really kind of coming up with internal policies to say this is what we're going to keep. This is, the time frame that we're going to do it. Have an expiration date. The meetings I was in earlier today around the date of birth on student cards, really reassess things you were doing in the past. I don't think they're going to fly in this day and age, right? So review your data, review it frequently. Because it really is like uranium, it's radioactive. You don't want to hold it if you don't have to. Okay.
Yeah. From my side of things, anytime that you are talking about data retention, it does have to start with legal or regulatory obligations when it comes to holding that information. But from there, you should be looking at what are the environments that are holding that data and how many of those records can I access at a time? How many do I need to access historically? And if there is a larger need, then how is that information, how's accountability of that access being maintained? If I have someone compromise a user account and start extracting information, is there going to be logs generated to tell me exactly what data they accessed and what was edited and when? So again, depending on the information you've got and the systems that you're holding it in, if retention is an absolute must and you can't get rid of it and it's got to be available all the time, then you start looking into those kind of accountability controls.
Yeah, awesome. It is 4:30, so I will bring us to a close. Want to say thank you to everybody who joined us this afternoon. Really appreciate your time. I hope that amongst this last hour, there has been pieces of information that you do find useful. We will distribute the link for the recording for the webinar out. And also a data security resource pack that we've been putting together. So we'll distribute the link to the webinar and the data security resource pack out to everybody who joined us. I'd like to say a very big